Hey, I'm Tamara and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. So last week, the town of Lytton, BC saw the hottest temperature ever recorded in Canada. It was 49.6 degrees Celsius on Wednesday, and the 1,000 or so people who lived in and around the town had already been dealing with that extreme heat for 3 days before suddenly they were forced to evacuate because of a wildfire. By the next day, the village was basically gone, burned to the ground.
Yeah, I'm not okay. I'm not okay. Because I basically ran for my life from a fire. And now don't know if my home is okay. I know my business is gone, and I know my community is gone. And I know my community is really suffering.
That is Megan Fandrich of Lytton, talking to the Globe's environment reporter Kathryn Blaze Baum, who's on the show today. As of right now, we know 2 people died in that fire, on top of the hundreds of other deaths in BC that are also being linked to an intense heat wave in the Pacific Northwest. Experts say this is all a sign of what's to come if we don't figure out how to slow down climate change or adapt to it.
The way it's been explained to me is that a lot of these effects are already baked in. We kind of are where we are, and we need to sort of do what we can going forward, is what climate activists would say.
Kathryn is going to take us through the latest from Lytton, what climate change has to do with this, and how we prepare for the future. That's today on The Decibel. Let's get into it. Hi, Kathryn.
Hi.
You and I are talking on Monday morning, and what do things look like in Lytton right now, and what kinds of conversations have you been having with residents of that town?
Literally minutes before you and I got on this conversation, I spoke with a woman named Megan Fandrich, who is the owner, or I guess was the owner, of Clowa Art Cafe in Lytton. And I had spoken with her last week when Lytton was under this extreme, heat wave and was hitting these record temperatures. And she went for a walk one night at midnight because she couldn't sleep. It was so hot. She looks out over the ridge towards George Road and she sees a fire, and we talk, and it's mostly under control. But then, just basically the very next day, a fire broke out, a separate fire broke out in the village, and she basically had to run for her life. And so just getting off the phone with her, she was quite emotional.
Yeah, I'm not okay. I'm not okay. I'm safe and my family's safe, but I'm not okay. So I was in my coffee shop. It was about 4:45 or 10:05. So we were just getting ready to close up at 5. And one of my employees went outside to take the compost out and came back in and said, "There's ash falling in the courtyard." And right then, someone from the community ran in and he said, "Megan, that fire is really close. You got to get out." We didn't even know there was a fire. There had a second before there had been no smoke outside other than the fire way off in the hills. But someone ran in and said, "The fire is really close. You got to get out." I stepped out. I looked at the neighbor across the street who was looking down the street, and I asked him, "Where's the fire?" And he said, "At Hobo Hollow," which is down the hill away from town, where the train bridge is. And I'm sure it was just at Hobo Hollow, but I said, "No, look, it's right there." It was right behind him already. It had jumped that fast. He was still looking for it where it began, and it was already lighting houses on fire. So my employees and I, we grabbed the cash and we closed the door and we ran. I ran to my car and I drove through the smoke. I might have been driving through the fire. I'm not sure. It was so smoky I couldn't see anything. But just when I came on the other side of the smoke, I could see my house down below me, and it was still green. So I pulled in and my parents pulled in as well. I got my cat. I got my work computer. I got my daughter's favorite stuffed animal, and a basket of laundry. And then we evacuated as the town was burning. As I drove away from town, I saw a big wall of flame behind me on the highway. And that was it crossing and burning up the homes across the highway from me.
She thinks that her home still exists, but most of those homes in Lytton do not. The entire main street has been razed. We know that at least 2 people have died. There are people missing. We've had reports of people who are having trouble being in touch with their loved ones because, some cell phone towers were actually disabled due to the fire. So we don't know how many people are missing. We don't know how many people have died. We don't know yet what caused this this devastating fire. We do know, or at least the wildfire services folks are saying, that it was human caused. People in the village, including Megan, believe that it may have been related to a passing train because the trains can give off sparks on the railways. And even something as small as a spark, as I understand it, can cause a massive fire because the situations in Lytton were just it was a perfect storm. It was very dry. There had been no moisture. It was basically tinder, and you light a match and we are where we are now.
And based on what you just said and the accounts that I've been reading from people in Lytton, it sounds like these were very narrow kind of escapes from this fire and that people were taken really by surprise.
That's totally right. I mean, one of our colleagues, Andrea Wu, she actually went to the area and she's been having conversations with evacuees, as have other colleagues of ours. And, they've had some pretty intense conversations, including with a Lytton resident named Dennis Higgs. And the way it was described was he got a text message warning of a fire in the BC town at 6:17 on Wednesday. He pops his head out of his trailer and doesn't even see smoke. 3 minutes later, he sees a flicker through his blinds, opens the door and sees a big, huge black cloud of smoke. He throws on his boots, and by then even, the flames are 10 to 20 feet in size, raging around his trailer. And by 6:26, so less than 10 minutes from when he first gets a text message, he's speeding away from the village with no time to pack his belongings. So this happened very, very fast. It was described as, embers raining down from the skies, people not even realizing they were burned until they got to safety. The sounds of screaming etched into the minds of people who bore witness to the survivors and what they had just fled.
It's terrifying. So why has it been so hot? Like, give me a scientific explanation for what's been happening.
Basically, you need to think of it as a few things coming together to keep this massive ridge of warm air initially parked over the Pacific Northwest, and then it did gradually, very slowly start making its way east. So meteorologists call this effect a heat dome, and that's because the warm air is trapped in a circulation pattern that prevents cooler air from moving in. So this year, there was an unseasonably dry spring in the region, and that served to amplify the high temperatures. So if there had been water in the air, the solar energy would have been used to evaporate that water. But because there was no moisture in the air, that solar energy has nowhere to go but to make the air hotter. And so the giant, weather system starts making its way eastward, but it happened so slowly and it stood over the Pacific Northwest for so long because of this wavy pattern in the jet stream called an omega block. And it basically allowed these temperatures to soar in the same locations each day over and over again, breaking the previous day's record with little or no relief. So just to sort of also touch on, how unusual is this? A heat dome isn't itself unusual, but the scale and impact of this one was described as off the charts. Scientists and climatologists have predicted, more warm weather and more frequent extreme weather events, including heat waves, are among the most consistently predicted outcomes of climate change owing to human-generated fossil fuel emissions. So we are likely to see more of this.
Okay, so what is the link between extreme heat and wildfires?
They do basically go hand in hand. Excessive heat creates a dangerous situation where, you've got intense heat and accompanied by a drought, as there was a period of dryness in the time leading up to the fire in Lytton and the area around then. And you basically have woodland that acts as tinder. And so heat allows whatever moisture is present to be sucked out of the brush, and it allows fires to start and spread more easily. And the other thing that we have to think about is lightning. So this record heat actually fueled completely unprecedented outbreaks of lightning in the Pacific Northwest. So there were something like over 700,000 lightning flashes across BC and northwestern Alberta in a span of only 15 hours. And so most of those were what are called in-cloud pulses, meaning the lightning jumps from one part of a cloud to another. But the rest were lightning strikes that actually hit the ground. And so the problem here is that those lightning strikes that hit the ground can actually start more fires, which then create what are called pyrocumulonimbus clouds, also known as fire-breathing clouds, which basically create their own weather system and create a firestorm, a literal firestorm, where electromagnetic energy has to be released, and it ends up getting released in the form of lightning, which causes more fires, and the cycle continues. So it can be very problematic.
So heat can increase the frequency and the intensity of wildfires. But what are other consequences of heat waves that we might not be thinking about?
So basically, a lot of our transportation infrastructure was not built for extreme heat. You can have issues with power grids. There can be failures in that regard. The Alberta Electric System Operator actually asked residents to conserve energy because it was probably concerned about a failure during the heat wave. So utilities and, public transport authorities, freight railways and others, they're starting to consider, I think it's fair to say, how extreme heat will affect Canada's power grids and transport networks and other infrastructure. But it hasn't really been a huge focus. And if I can just give you, one really concrete example of the ways in which, even our hospitals aren't necessarily built to withstand the impacts of climate change, including heat waves and forest fires. The doctor I spoke with, Dr. Courtney Howard, she described that, during unprecedented fires in 2014, the hospital in Yellowknife had to cancel elective surgeries for at least a week because of air quality concerns in the operating room. And that's because the ventilation system was drawing in air from the outside. So it was drawing in smoke as well, rather than recirculating from within the hospital. So there are things that we can sort of foresee, and then there are things that we cannot foresee. And now I think people are starting to really, architects and engineers are starting to really wrap their heads around how to build for the new world that we are living in.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that you wrote about in your piece that I hadn't thought about was that the weather system is causing rapid melting of snow on mountains, which basically creates flooding concerns, right? Like that is probably something that people haven't thought of either.
Oh, it's so counterintuitive, I think, for people to think about that. And, as a town is burning and people are dying of heat stroke, there's also flash flood warnings. I mean, it is quite odd to wrap your head around, but, it does actually all sort of hang together. And these are what one senior climatologist with Environment Canada, I believe, said that the conditions in Canada, in Western Canada last week were, quote unquote, almost biblical.
Okay, so what we've seen in the West Coast over the last week is quite shocking, but it sounds like we should expect this to happen more and more often. So is this the new normal?
The doctor that I spoke with said, basically, this isn't the new normal. It's only going to get worse, which isn't so optimistic, but in her mind is the reality of the situation that we are in. And so, I mean, we are in the months leading up to the Conference of the Parties, the UN COP26 that's happening in November. And, there are countries like Canada are upping the ante and they're setting more ambitious targets. And so if we can keep the temperature from warming, if we can slow that, then we can rein in probably some of the climate change effects. But the way it's been explained to me is that a lot of these effects are already baked in. And so we kind of are where we are, and we need to sort of do what we can going forward is what climate activists would say.
So how ready are we to deal with these heat waves becoming more frequent? I'm wondering because when you look at what happened in Lytton, it's hard to feel reassured and like we're ready for what's coming.
It is hard to feel reassured, and I think it's hard for the people of Lytton to feel reassured and those in BC who have lost loved ones to extreme heat, whether it was heat stroke or other heat-related illnesses. So, I mean, there are things I think that can be done at the personal level, and then there are things that companies and governments can do. At the personal level, I mean, only about a fifth of households in Vancouver have air conditioning, and that was in 2017, but that's the most recent Statistics Canada data. So that will have to change. But there are, socioeconomic considerations there. I mean, not everyone can just go out and make sure that the home that they live in is air conditioned, and not everybody has a home. And so cities will have to ensure that they have adequate space for cooling centers. And like I said, particularly for people experiencing homelessness or those without access to air conditioning. Some other things that people can do is install heat-resistant curtains in their bedrooms and ensure that any outdoor space that they have, for example, a balcony, has some greenery. And that is because of this urban heat island effect. Artificial surfaces like concrete absorb and re-emit the sun's heat more than natural landscapes. And so the difference in daytime surface temperatures between, a concrete covered urban area and a grass or wetland covered rural area can be as high as 15 degrees. Mm-hmm. And this is why, cities such as Quebec have created parking lot standards. And that can seem pretty unsexy topic to most people, but it's actually pretty interesting. They are suggesting ways to reduce the surface area of the lot, to revegetate the space and use materials with a high solar reflective index, natural assets and natural climate solutions. So just recently, there was a study from the Science Advances. And this recent report identified a suite of actions targeting forests, grasslands, farmlands, and wetlands that could help Canada, cut its emissions, help preserve diversity, and start to stem some of the impacts of climate change. So these natural climate solutions can be anything from protecting grasslands to planting trees along cash crops and avoiding peatland disturbance and transforming crop residue into, things like biochar, which is a highly stable form of carbon that can be added to soil to improve its quality. So Ottawa has committed, $4 billion over 10 years for these kinds of natural climate solutions. So things are being done and changes are being made.
Okay, and so what's next for the residents of Lytton? Where are they going to go? What are they going to do?
So when I spoke with Megan today, she is living, she's evacuated. She at first was living south of Lytton. Now she's living closer to Vancouver. She's been reunited with her young daughter. She's just sort of really in shock and grappling with the loss of her livelihood. But as she put it, she believes that her home is still standing, and that cannot be said for most Lytton residents. Mm-hmm. We still don't know how many people died. People still can't get a hold of loved ones. There's concerns that there may be more than the 2 fatalities that we will be learning about. And when I spoke with Megan, I said, what message do you have for Canadians who are really gripped by what's happened to your community? And she basically said,
I'd like to ask people not right now to reach out to us about how we're going to rebuild, about the benefit concerts they're going to do for us, about all these ways that they're going to save our community, to rebuild our community. We need space to deal with this grief and this loss. First, we need to find out where our loved ones are, who survived the fire. Then we need to find out where we can stay. We're not going to be allowed back in until October. And then maybe after that, start talking to us about rebuilding.
Most Lytton residents will have nothing to go back to.
Okay, Kathryn, thank you so much. I really appreciate this.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that's it for today. I'm your host, Tamara Kandaker. The Decibel is produced by Madeline White and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to Kathryn Blaze Baum. You can find her on Twitter at kblazebaum. If you want to reach us, email us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter at anima_tk. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.